The first thing they gave him was a script. It was 2 pages long, printed on off-white paper that smelled of recycled air, and the very first sentence read, "Sorry to bother you." Kale Voss held it in both hands in the gray anteroom of the Xenovast Outreach Division and read that sentence 3 times before he understood it wasn't an apology. It was a tool. It was the blade hidden inside a handshake. He'd been sleeping in his uncle's storage unit for 11 weeks at that point. Not a metaphor. An actual corrugated metal box on the outer ring of Meridian Station, where the recycled oxygen always tasted faintly of machine grease, and the humidity ran just high enough to make everything feel slightly damp. His girlfriend V had a cot wedged between a rusted shelving unit and a box of her own paintings. Canvases she'd stretched herself and primed with asteroid clay gesso, stacked 4 deep. She was an artist. She also worked 16-hour shifts at the docking slapping magnetic seals on ore containers. She never complained about the storage unit. That somehow made it worse. Kale had been laid off from the atmospheric processing plant on Level 7 9 months ago, along with about 400 other humans, when Xenovast Corporation brought in their first wave of Grethali labor units. The Grethali were gray, 7-limbed beings from the Vela system who didn't require sleep, didn't require health coverage, and were legally classified under Xenovast's charter as a biological workforce asset, rather than employees. They were not cruel, they were simply cheaper. The distinction, Kale had decided, did not matter very much when you were trying to explain to your uncle why you needed to keep parking your life in his storage unit. The Xenovast Outreach Division was hiring humans for something called interspecies client engagement, which the job listing described in so many words that it took 3 readings to understand they meant telephone sales. Human voices, it turned out, still closed certain deals that automated systems couldn't. There were species in the Meridian Compact, the Talari, the Deepwater Cashin, several others, who found machine voices offensive in a way that was difficult to translate, a kind of spiritual wrongness they couldn't articulate but could feel the way a human feels a dentist's drill before it actually hits nerve. For those clients, you needed a warm body. You needed a human voice. The position paid commission only. Kale took it. He sat through the orientation in a room with 40 other humans, most of them looking the way he felt, holding their face in the expression of someone who has decided not to react to anything until they know what they're reacting to. A Grethali supervisor moved along the far wall, limbs folded into a resting configuration, its translation collar blinking green. A man named Sojo was sitting next to Kale. Sojo was older, somewhere north of 50, with the kind of unhurried quality about him that comes either from wisdom or from having given up entirely. He leaned over during the supervisor's welcome speech and spoke in a low voice without looking at KL. "You're going to have trouble at first," Sojo said. "I haven't started yet. Doesn't matter. You're going to try to sound like yourself. That's the mistake." He looked at Kale for the first time. His eyes were dark and careful. These clients, the Talari especially, they're not buying from you. They're buying from an idea of you, from whatever they think a human is. You have to become that, not yourself. The idea. Kale didn't fully understand what he meant for another 3 days. His first week on the call floor was an education in failure. He sat in his pod, a narrow cubicle with a cracked gel seat and a terminal that smelled of previous occupants, and called Talari purchasing managers and tried to pitch them on waste reclamation contracts, and every call ended the same way. A pause, a polite click, silence. Not even hostility, just the quiet of a door closing. He went home to the storage unit on the second day with 0 commissions and ate a protein bar, sitting on the edge of V's cot while she slept, her paint-stained hand over her eyes. And he looked at the stacked canvases and thought about how much of their life existed in this 40-square-meter box and whether any of it was going to get out. On the 4th day, he called his 43rd Talari client of the week, a procurement officer at a Meridian shipping cooperative, and was 3 words into his pitch when the line went dead. He sat there with the headset on and the dead line humming, and something cracked open in his chest. Not grief, exactly. Something colder and more specific. He put the headset down, walked to the water dispenser, filled a cup, drank it in one go, and walked back. He sat down, he put the headset on, he closed his eyes. He thought about what Sojo had said. Not yourself, the idea. He thought about what the Talari expected. They'd never met most humans in person. They knew human culture from trade documents, from entertainment feeds, from the curated projection of humanity that moved through the Meridian Compact like smoke, confident, unhurried, somehow warm despite the void it crossed. Not the humans standing in storage units eating protein bars. The other kind, the kind from the old recordings, the kind who had all the time in the world. He called the next number on his list. When the Talari procurement officer picked up, Kale heard himself speaking and was surprised by the voice that came out. Slower, lower in the register. A voice that suggested it had nowhere pressing to be. A voice that did not apologize in advance for existing. He wasn't performing. He was channeling something. Some composite ghost of every human he'd ever seen project that quality of settled ease, that assumption of welcome. It worked in a way that felt almost obscene. The procurement officer stayed on the call for 20 minutes. At the end, he signed a 2-year contract on 4,000 units of processed shielding compound. Kale stared at the commission notification on his terminal for a full minute before he remembered to breathe. He called V. She picked up on the second ring, and when she heard his voice she said, "What happened?" Not a question, reading him through whatever antenna years of loving someone properly calibrates. "I think I figured something out," he said. "I'm not sure I like it." "Tell me later," she said. "I'm in the middle of something." He heard spray paint hissing in the background. She was working on a piece. She did them on the inner walls of the loading bays on level 3. Enormous murals that the Port Authority kept repainting over, and that she kept repainting back. A slow war of images versus primer. He'd asked her once what they were supposed to mean, and she'd given him a look that managed to be both patient and slightly withering and said, "They mean whatever it costs you to look at them." He sat back in his cracked gel seat and thought about the voice he'd used. It didn't feel like a lie exactly. It felt like wearing someone else's coat. It kept the cold out. That was something. He got promoted 6 weeks later. He hadn't intended to. He'd been quietly good at the job. Top tier in his cohort, not by ambition but by the compounding effect of the things Sojo had shown him, which turned out to be less a trick than a skill. The way a language is a skill, requiring constant recalibration and an exhausting attention to silence. He knew how to listen to what a Tolari client wasn't saying, where the hesitation lived in a pause, how to meet it without crowding it. It turned out humans were good at this. Turns out a few 100,000 years of social evolution in close quarters left some marks. But he'd also been doing something else. His coworker Priya had started a collective. Not quite a union. She was careful with the word because of what it would trigger in the Grethali supervisors. More of an engagement cohort, a loose group that met in the break room and talked about working conditions. Shift lengths. The air quality on the call floor, which was genuinely bad, filtered through a system calibrated for Grethali biology and not quite right for humans. The commission structure, which had been quietly adjusted twice in the months since KL started, each adjustment trimming the rate by 2 points in language buried in a company update. Priya had noticed. Priya noticed everything. She was the kind of person who made the management nervous simply by being organized. She had a small notebook, a physical one, which she carried everywhere, and she wrote things down in it in a cramped hand. She'd recruited Sojo early. She'd recruited Sakale somewhere around week 3, which was before he'd found his voice, when he was still failing and therefore had nothing to lose. "I don't want to cause trouble," Kale had said. "I'm not asking you to cause trouble," Priya said. "I'm asking you to show up to a meeting." He'd shown up to the meeting. He'd shown up to the next one too. He'd started paying attention to the way the commission rate crept down, to the way the shift floor stayed slightly cold, to the way the Grethali supervisors logged response time on calls to the millisecond and flagged any human who dropped below threshold. The humans were already performing. The humans were being optimized. The distinction between labor and product was getting narrow, and the narrowing had a direction. The promotion arrived anyway. Management called him into an office with better air filtration. A human manager named Corvin, who wore a jacket slightly too expensive for someone who'd earned it honestly, and the information that Kale had been selected for the Tier 1 outreach team. The Tier 1 team had a different client list, not shipping companies and bulk purchasing offices, entities, sovereign trading houses, system-level contracts that moved enough material to change the atmospheric composition of moons. The commission rates were different too. He called V. "They want to move me up," he said. A pause on the line. He heard the ambient sound of wherever she was. An outdoor level somewhere, wind, moving through cable arrays. "What does that mean?" "More money. Different clients." He rubbed his face. "Different building, different floor. What do you have to give up?" He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. "The cohort meetings," he said finally. "Precious thing. Are you asking me or telling?" "No." Another pause, then she said, I'm going to be in a showing next month. Unauthorized gallery, level 9. The Port Authority will probably come. She said this the way she said most things. Flat, factual, without drama. So whatever you decide, it's fine. I know who you are. He sat with that for a long time after the call ended. He thought about the storage unit. He thought about Sojo's face when Sojo explained about the voice. The careful eyes of a man who had made a version of this calculation already and was not judging KL for standing at the same crossroads. He thought about his uncle, who had opened the storage unit without being asked, and never once made KL feel bad about it, who was now looking at a debt to Xenovast's company housing program that was compounding at a rate that would eventually exceed his ability to service it. He took the promotion. The Tier 1 floor was a different world in the way that all vertical hierarchies create different worlds. Not so much separated from the one below as insulated from it. A layer of physical comfort and ambient quiet that made the previous floor feel hypothetical. The air was correct. The chairs were designed for humans. There were actual windows which looked out on the inner ring transit hub, a vista of ships moving in slow arcs against the station's external lighting, which KL found briefly beautiful, and then stopped seeing after 2 weeks. His team lead was a man who went by Marsh, who had the quality of someone who had been extraordinary once, and had made peace with becoming merely excellent. He ran through the Tier 1 client protocols with a thoroughness that suggested he'd given this briefing many times, and still considered it important. He showed Kale the client roster. He showed Kale the commission calculator. He showed Kale the numbers on what a good quarter looked like. And Kale did the math in his head and stood very still for a moment. You'll be fine, Marsh said. He was looking at Kale with the expression of someone who has seen the math hit a lot of people and knows what comes next. What are we actually selling? Kale asked. Marsh paused for a fraction of a second. Infrastructure solutions, which means logistics architecture, labor deployment, resource acquisition packages. He looked at the window. The Grethathi program primarily. We source and deploy Grethali labor units to system-level clients who need biological workforce assets at scale. It's a growth segment. KL heard himself say the next thing before he decided to say it. We're selling them as workers. To corporations. We're facilitating labor deployment contracts, Marsh said. He was not defensive, he was not guilty, he was simply precise. The Grethali signed the contracts. They have legal standing in the compact. Legal standing they can't exercise because they're 6 systems from the nearest compact authority, and their contracts run 30 years. Marsh looked at him. There was something in the look that was neither approval nor disapproval. You're going to be good at this, he said, because you understand what you're selling. He clicked off the briefing screen. Understanding what you're selling and selling it are different skills. Most people don't separate them. Kale went home that night, not to the storage unit. They'd moved into an actual room in the level 5 residential block by then, small but real, with a door that locked and a window that faced a light well, and lay on his back looking at the ceiling while V slept beside him. Her paint-stained hand was on her sternum, rising and falling. He thought about Marsh's face. He thought about 30-year labor contracts on being 6 systems from any help. He thought about the commission calculator, and the numbers it had shown him, and about his uncle's debt, and about the storage unit, and the protein bars, and the smell of machine grease in the recycled air. He called his first Tier 1 client the following morning using the voice, and sold a 12,000-unit Grethali labor deployment to a terraforming consortium operating in the outer belt. He did not feel good about it. He got very efficient at not feeling good about it, the way you get efficient at anything you do every day. He started to understand the architecture of what he was inside of around the 3rd month. It happened in pieces. A conversation with Marsh about a client who'd complained that a Grethali unit had malfunctioned, which turned out to mean it had stopped working after 420 continuous hours of operation without rest. A memo distributed company-wide about optimizing the interface between human sales staff and Grethali operational assets that read carefully was about minimizing any situation in which human staff might develop what the memo called asymmetric empathic identification with Grethali units. A quarterly briefing in which a Xenovast executive named Dresh appeared via holographic projection from wherever executives appeared from, and spoke for 40 minutes about the growth potential of what he called integrated biological logistics, and whose face had the quality of a man who had never in his life been asked to account for the specific gravity of what he was describing. Quayle thought about Priya's notebook. He thought about the cohort meeting he hadn't gone to in 3 months. He thought about V's murals on the loading bay walls, the enormous figures she painted in pigments that came from compressed mineral dust she collected from the ore containers, images of bodies mid-motion, faces upturned, something reaching or refusing. He'd gone to see them twice in the middle of the night, alone, and stood in front of them in the maintenance lighting, with his hands in his jacket pockets, trying to understand what they were asking of him. They didn't tell him anything directly. They just held a space open and waited. He went back to Priya's cohort meeting on a Thursday. She looked up when he walked in. She didn't say anything. She just nodded slightly and made a very small mark in her notebook. "You're back," Sojo said. "I'm back," Kale said. He sat down. "Tell me what I missed." What he'd missed was considerable. The commission rate had been cut again, 3 points this time, flagged as a structural realignment in a 400-word communication that contained the actual number precisely once, in parentheses, in the 3rd paragraph. The air quality complaint had been officially logged with the station authority and officially lost. 2 members of the cohort had been quietly shifted to shorter-hour contracts after asking questions at a company meeting. Priya had documented all of it. She showed him the notebook, pages dense with dates and names and numbers in her cramped handwriting. "They're not scared of us," Priya said. "They think we're a nuisance. That's worse in some ways." "Nuisances get swatted," Sojo said. "Nuisances also underestimate their own effect," Priya said. She looked at Kale. "You've been up there 3 months. What do you know?" he told her. He told her about the labor deployment architecture, about the Grethali contracts, about the 30-year terms and the distance from any compact authority. He told her about the memo, about the word asymmetric empathic identification. He watched her write it down in the notebook. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So the thing that they're afraid of is empathy." "Apparently." "Good," she said. "That's something we have." The crisis came faster than he expected. Xenovast announced a restructuring of the call floor, the human call floor, specifically, in which commission rates would be reset to a lower baseline and shifts would be extended by 4 hours, aligned to Grethali operational rhythms. The announcement used phrases like cross-species workflow harmonization and unified operational cadence. What it meant was that the humans would now work on the Grethali schedule, which was designed for beings who didn't require sleep. Priya called a full cohort meeting. 23 people showed up, in the storage level on the outer ring, because that was the only space they could use without it showing up on a facility log. Kale stood in the back next to Sojo and watched people talk. Some were angry, some were scared, some were both, which is most of the time what anger actually is. Priya spoke last. She laid out what they could do, what protections existed in the compact's labor framework, what could be invoked, what would cost them, and what wouldn't, what the risks were. She was meticulous. She had clearly been preparing for this for months, maybe longer. "If we push back formally," she said, "some of us will get cut. That's real. They'll make examples." She looked around the room. "But if we don't push back, the conditions get worse on their schedule, not ours, and then they get worse again." She paused. "I can't tell you what to choose. I can tell you what I'm choosing." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Sojo, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, said quietly, "I've done this before. Different station, different corporation, 30 years ago. He didn't say what happened. I'm in." Kale thought about the 30-year Grethali contracts. He thought about the memo about empathy. He thought about V, somewhere on level 3 right now, repainting a mural over the Port Authority's primer in pigments ground from ore dust, and what it must feel like to make something that purely refuses erasure. "I'm in," he said. They went public with their action on a Tuesday morning at the start of the first shift under the new schedule. They filed simultaneously with the Compact Labor Registry, posted documentation to the Station Information Network, and stood outside the call floor entrance in a loose line, which was the Compact's legally required form of industrial action. It was not immediately impressive. 23 people standing in a corridor with laminated notices is not a dramatic image. A few other station workers passing by stopped to look. A Grethali maintenance unit wheeled past without slowing. The Xenovast security detail, 2 humans, both of whom Kale recognized from the cafeteria, both of whom looked uncomfortable, positioned themselves 10 meters away and did nothing. Priya stood at the center of the line with her notebook under her arm. She looked calm in the way that deep water looks calm. Then the Grethali showed up. Not the supervisors, not the management tier units, the labor units. The ones from the call floor. The ones who worked the 400-hour shifts. The ones whose contracts Kale had spent 3 months selling at commission. They came in a group of 40, moving with the odd fluid coordination of beings whose multiple limbs had evolved for collective motion, and they positioned themselves alongside the human line, not inside it, not replacing it, alongside it. Their translation collars were blinking. One of them, older, its gray integument faded at the joints, stepped forward and produced a communication from somewhere inside its body that Kale absolutely did not want to think about too hard. A folded document on compact standard paper, and held it out to Priya. Priya took it. She read it. Her face did a complicated thing that it didn't usually do. "They're filing too," she said, independent but coordinated. She looked up at the Grethali unit. "How long have you been planning this?" The translation caller rendered the response in a voice like wind moving through cables. "Longer than you." Kale stood in the line and felt something shift inside him. Not the floor, not his body, but something structural, some load-bearing assumption he hadn't known he was carrying. He'd been thinking of the Grethali as the problem. As the reason he'd been displaced, the reason the commission rates kept dropping, the reason the conditions kept tightening. He had not been thinking of them as beings who had also been displaced, also tightened, also fitted into a system that converted their existence into a quarterly earnings figure. He had been helping sell that system. He stood in the line and breathed recycled station air, and looked at the Grethali standing beside them. And he felt something move through him that was close to shame and close to something else. Something that had more forward motion in it. The Xenovast security detail called for reinforcement. The station authority showed up 20 minutes later, 6 officers in joint operations gear, which on Meridian Station meant a hybrid of human and Grethali-adapted equipment that always looked slightly wrong for both species. They moved toward the line. The lead officer, a woman whose name Kale would later learn was Sergeant Vane, told them through a speaker collar that they were in violation of a company-filed corridor access restriction and needed to disperse. "We're operating under Compact Labor Code 714, Priya said. She had a document for this too. She held it up. "This is a registered industrial action. The corridor is not subject to private access restriction during registered action." The corridor access restriction was filed under Station Regulation 44, which supersedes Compact Code, Vane said. Station Regulation 44 applies to emergency transit corridors. This corridor is classified as general access under the station map filed in 2031, which we have here. Priya produced another document. She had a whole stack. She was, Kale realized, carrying a notebook full of specific answers to specific things that were going to happen in a specific order. Which meant she had thought about all of this in advance. Which meant she was one of the most formidable people he'd ever stood next to. The situation held for about 3 minutes, which is a very long time when you're standing in a corridor with security officers looking at you. Then one of the officers stepped forward and made a mistake. He reached for Priya's notebook. She didn't let go. There was a brief struggle that lasted about 4 seconds, at the end of which Priya was on the ground with a bruised wrist, and the officer was holding a notebook that had nothing classified in it. Just her handwriting, just the record, just the dates and names, and the memo about asymmetric empathic identification. A second officer reached for Sojo. That was when the Grethali moved. They didn't move aggressively. They didn't charge or strike. They simply repositioned. 6 the larger units, moving with fluid collective grace, placing themselves between the officers and the humans with a calm that was somehow more frightening than any threat would have been. Their translation collars were all blinking yellow now, which Kale had never seen before, and would later learn meant, "This interaction is being formally recorded under Compact Witness Protocol." Sergeant Vane stopped. She looked at the Grethali. She looked at the cameras on her officers' equipment, which were also recording, which would also go into a formal record. She made a decision. She pulled her officers back. The corridor was quiet for a moment. Just the sound of recycled air moving through the vents, and Priya sitting up on the floor checking her wrist, and 40 Grethali standing in their odd perfect stillness, recording everything. Kale crouched down next to Priya. "Are you okay, my wrist?" She flexed it. "Bruised, fine." She looked up at the Grethali. "That was your witness protocol?" The old Grethali with the faded integument stepped forward again. Under the compact, witnessed physical altercation during registered industrial action requires a formal investigation. All officers involved are suspended from further action pending review. The translation caller rendered a pause that felt deliberate. We have been watching the regulatory framework for some time. Priya looked at it for a moment, then she laughed. It was a short sound startled out of her reel. Longer than us, she said. Yes, it said. We learn quickly. The formal investigation lasted 6 weeks and produced a binding compact ruling that the corridor access restriction had been improperly filed. The Xenovast restructuring was suspended pending labor framework review. The commission rate cut was rolled back. Priya's cohort was formally registered as a labor engagement body under compact code, which gave it standing that nuisance no longer covered. None of this happened cleanly or quickly. It happened in increments, in filings and counterfilings and hearings that took place in administrative rooms on level 2, with bad lighting and chairs, that were genuinely neutral on the question of which species had designed them. Priya went to all of them with her notebook. Sojo went to most of them. Kale went to the ones that required someone who knew the Tier 1 sales architecture from the inside, which turned out to be several. He'd submitted his resignation from Tier 1 the morning after the corridor action. Corvin, his manager, had looked at him with the expression of someone who had expected this and was neither surprised nor particularly moved by it. You understand what you're walking away from, Corvin said. I understand what I was doing, Kale said. Which wasn't quite an answer but was what he had. He went back to the standard call floor. The commission rates were lower. The air was not quite right. Sojo was already there in his pod and nodded when Kale sat down in the adjacent cubicle. They sat together in a comfortable silence for a moment. How's V? Sojo asked. She's painting something new, Kale said, on level 7. Near the atmospheric processing plant. Sojo nodded. I'll go see it. They put their headsets on. Kale's first call of the day was a Talari Agricultural Cooperative 3 systems out, looking for shielding compound for a grain storage expansion. He settled into his chair. He thought about the voice, not the performance of it, not the ghost in the coat, but what was underneath it, what had always been there. The thing that made the Talari stay on the call. It wasn't an accent or a register, it was attention. It was the specific human practice of treating a pause as something worth sitting with, of not rushing the silence, of letting another being feel heard across the void. He pressed dial. Hello, he said, just his own voice. Kale Voss, level 5 residential block, formerly of a storage unit on the outer ring, currently of a call floor with slightly bad air and a bruise on his coworker's wrist that was already fading. Sorry to bother you. He meant it this time. The Talari buyer stayed on the call. 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, Dresh, the Xenovast executive who gave holographic briefings from distant rooms, appeared on the station's public information network in a 12-minute address about Xenovast's renewed commitment to compact labor standards and deep respect for the cooperative relationship between human and Grethali workforce partners. He said workforce partners 4 times. He never said Priya's name or the cohort's name or Kale's name or any Grethali unit's name. He said workforce partners again at the end, as a kind of coda, a verbal habit that was trying to sound like a conclusion. The old Grethali unit with the faded integument, whose name, rendered in compact script, was something that translated as the one who waited for the right document. Watched the address from a terminal on the call floor. When it ended, the unit turned to Kale, and its translation caller rendered something that took a moment to parse. He has learned the words, it said, but not what they require. Kale looked at the terminal screen, at Dresh's face going still in the frozen final frame, composed in an expression of sincerity that had been calibrated very carefully. No, Kale said. He hasn't. The Grethali unit folded 2 of its limbs in a configuration Kale had started to recognize as the equivalent of a shrug. A gesture it had, he suspected, learned from watching humans, just as he had learned of things from watching the Grethali hold still in corridors and produce documents at precise moments and record everything with the patient thoroughness of beings who understood that the record is the weapon, when the weapon is all you have. There is a thing that happens sometimes in the dark stretches between stars, in the recycled air of stations that smell of machine grease, in the storage units and call floors and administrative hearings of the worlds humans have moved into and tried to make habitable. It is not a dramatic thing. It does not look like anything from the outside. It is simply the moment when 2 different kinds of beings look at each other, across the fact of their shared condition and decide, without ceremony, that the math works better together. It is when it happens, the most human thing in the universe. It is also, it turns out, the most Grethali. V's new mural was on the interior wall of the atmospheric processing plant on level 7, the one Kale had been laid off from 9 months ago. She'd done it in 3 nights, working in the maintenance shift window, using every color she had. It was enormous. It covered most of the wall. It showed 2 figures, one human, one Grethali, standing side by side in a corridor with their backs to the viewer, facing something the viewer couldn't see. Between them, their hands were touching. Not holding, touching. A specific distinction that VA understood and rendered with the precision of someone who had thought very carefully about what gesture does and does not promise. On the wall beside the mural, in small letters in her handwriting, she had written, "Sorry to bother you. We intend to keep doing it." The Port Authority painted over it 11 days later. She went back the following night with her pigments ground from ore dust and painted it again. She would paint it again until they stopped painting over it, or until the wall fell down, whichever came first. Kale brought her coffee on the second night and stood in the maintenance lighting watching her work, and thought that of the 2 of them she had always been the one who understood what the thing actually required. Not the voice, not the argument, not even the document. Just the refusal, just the patient, relentless, completely unreasonable insistence on being here, on this wall, in this light scene. He handed her the coffee. She took it without turning around, still working. "Is it good?" he asked. She looked at the wall for a moment, at the 2 figures, at the light she'd gotten right and the shadow she was still working on. "Ask me when it's done," she said. He stood beside her in the dark and watched her paint, and did not go home until she was ready to go home. And they walked back through the recycled air of Meridian Station with paint on her hands and on the edge of his jacket sleeve where he'd leaned against the wall. And the station turned slowly around its axis the way it always did, indifferent and enormous. And they were inside it, which is the only place there is to be.